Before we dive into one of the most shocking revelations about Australia's national security ever made public, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Because what this SAS colonel revealed affects not just Australians, but every allied nation counting on the Indo-Pacific Defense Network. This isn't just another military analysis video. This is about the moment when one man's courage to speak an uncomfortable truth shattered decades of comfortable lies. Imagine standing in a room full of the most powerful defense officials in your country. Generals with chests full of medals. Politicians who control billion-dollar budgets. Strategic advisors who've spent their entire careers planning for every contingency. Now imagine telling them that everything they believe about their nation's security is a dangerous fantasy. That their plans are worthless. That their systems wouldn't last 6 hours against a real threat. And imagine doing it knowing that speaking this truth could end your career, destroy your reputation, and make you a pariah among the very community you've served your entire life. This is exactly what Colonel David Morrison did on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. And what happened next revealed something far more dangerous than any enemy bomber. The willingness of institutions to sacrifice truth on the altar of convenience. Colonel Morrison wasn't supposed to be at that defense briefing. He was 3 weeks into terminal leave, transitioning out of active service after 28 years in the Special Air Service Regiment. 28 years of operations across 3 continents. A veteran of East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen missions still classified. He'd been the quiet professional who never sought the spotlight, who declined media interviews, who let his operational record speak for itself. His superiors described him as technically brilliant but politically naive, which in military circles is often code for tells the truth. When we'd prefer he didn't. But Morrison had been invited to this particular briefing by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Air Marshal Gregory Chen, Deputy Chief of the Defense Force, who'd served alongside Morrison in a joint task force operation in 2019. Chen had watched Morrison identify a critical intelligence gap that prevented a catastrophic friendly fire incident. He knew that Morrison saw patterns others missed, asked questions others avoided, and possessed an almost uncomfortable clarity about operational realities. The briefing was meant to showcase Australia's new integrated air and missile defense system, a network of radars, command centers, and surface-to-air missile batteries that had consumed $3 billion over 7 years of development. The presentation was slick. Animated graphics showed interlocking circles of coverage. Probability calculations demonstrated a 94% interception rate against incoming threats. Timeline charts illustrated coordinated responses across multiple platforms. Defense Minister Patricia Huntley was there, preparing to announce the system's operational status to Parliament that afternoon. Brigadier General Marcus Whitfield, who'd championed the program from its inception, stood beside the screen with barely contained pride. His career trajectory depended on this system's success. Morrison sat in the back row, his weathered face impassive, taking no notes. He'd reviewed the classified technical specifications the night before, and what he'd read had kept him awake until 3 in the morning, cross-referencing engagement ranges, cycling through scenario simulations in his head, calculating the mathematics of vulnerability that others seemed determined to ignore. When the presentation concluded, Minister Huntley smiled broadly. "Gentlemen, we can finally assure the Australian people that the northern approaches are secure. Our sovereign capability is now demonstrated." Heads nodded. Around the table, Whitfield's chest visibly swelled. The silence stretched for perhaps 5 seconds before Morrison spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made his words cut deeper. "With respect, Minister, that statement is operationally incorrect." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. All eyes turned to the colonel in civilian clothes sitting in the back. Minister Huntley's smile froze. "I'm sorry, who are?" "Colonel David Morrison, SASR. Terminal leave." He stood, not in a gesture of aggression, but out of habit. "You address ministers on your feet." And with all due respect to Brigadier Whitfield's team, the system as presented would not defend Darwin against a determined strike. It might not defend it against an undetermined strike. Whitfield's face flushed crimson. "Colonel, you're commenting on materials you haven't reviewed. Systems you haven't." "I reviewed the specifications at 2300 hours last night. Classification level TS Osteo. Section 4, subsection 12, engagement envelopes. The short-range missiles have an effective ceiling of 12 kilometers and a maximum engagement range of 40 kilometers under optimal conditions. The long-range interceptors, all 6 of them currently deployed, require 17 minutes from detection to launch readiness if the crews are on site. 23 minutes if they're at barracks, which is standard peacetime posture. The specificity landed like a grenade. Several officials exchanged glances. Chen's expression remained neutral, but his fingers stopped their idle drumming on the table. Whitfield stepped forward, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. Colonel, your service record is noted, but strategic air defense is not special operations. This is systems integration, network architecture, coordinated response protocols. It's mathematics, Morrison interrupted, his voice still calm. And Su-34 bomber departing from a hypothetical forward operating base 800 kilometers north, traveling at Mach 1.2, reaches Darwin in 42 minutes. If it releases standoff weapons at 300 kilometers, well within standard doctrine, those weapons arrive in Darwin in 16 minutes. Our long-range interceptors need 17 minutes just to achieve launch readiness. The short-range systems can't engage until the weapons are already over the city. You're presenting a worst-case scenario, Whitfield began. I'm presenting basic arithmetic. The enemy doesn't wait for optimal conditions. They create worst-case scenarios. That's the entire point of military operations. Minister Huntley leaned forward, her political instincts sensing danger. Colonel Morrison, I appreciate your passion, but we have teams of analysts who've studied these scenarios extensively. Surely you're not suggesting they've all missed something obvious? Morrison met her gaze steadily. Yes, Minister. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. Because acknowledging what I'm saying would require admitting that $3 billion bought us a system designed for exercises, not warfare, and that's not a career-enhancing admission for anyone in this room. The audacity of this statement hung in the air like smoke. You could hear the ventilation system humming. Someone's phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. This wasn't just technical criticism. This was an accusation of institutional self-deception. Air Vice Marshal Robert Thornton, Director of Strategic Planning, entered the fray. His voice dripped with condescension. Colonel, I've been planning air defense architecture for 23 years. I've run simulations with RAND Corporation, participated in NATO integration studies, and coordinated with U.S. Pacific Command on response protocols. Are you genuinely suggesting that your experience hunting insurgents in Afghanistan qualifies you to? I'm suggesting that my experience getting mortared by insurgents who had no air force taught me what happens when you confuse planning documents with reality. Morrison's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath now. I'm suggesting that I've called in danger close air support while rounds were incoming, and I learned very quickly the difference between theoretical response times and actual response times. I'm suggesting that the Taliban didn't care about our NATO integration studies when they were dropping mortars on our position, and China won't care about your simulations when they're dropping missiles on Darwin. This is absurd, Whitfield sputtered, looking to Minister Huntley for support. We have partnerships, protocols, intelligence sharing. We have dependencies, Morrison corrected. Partnerships become dependencies the moment you can't function without them. Right now, tonight, if hostilities began, Darwin's defense rests entirely on American willingness to immediately deploy assets from Guam or Japanese bases, not Australian capability, American political will, and we're betting our northern territories on the assumption that American response will be immediate and overwhelming. What happens if it's not? What happens if they're engaged in two theaters simultaneously? What happens if their assessment of the strategic situation differs from ours? Morrison pulled a single sheet of paper from his jacket pocket, unfolded it. I ran a scenario last night. Conservative assumptions: 6 medium bombers, each carrying 4 standoff weapons. Total of 24 incoming. Targets: staggered launch from multiple vectors to split our response. Our current system, at full readiness, which is not peacetime posture, could engage perhaps 8 targets, 16 get through. Each warhead is 450 kilograms. Darwin International Airport, gone. RAAF base, Darwin, combat ineffective. Port facilities, destroyed. 6 hours of actual warfare, and our entire top end is neutralized. Not occupied, just erased as a military factor. The silence was suffocating. Several officials stared at their folders, unwilling to meet Morrison's eyes. Others looked angry, but it was the anger of people confronted with truths they'd been skillfully avoiding. Minister Huntley's voice was icy now, her political survival instincts fully engaged. Colonel Morrison, you're painting a picture of negligence, of incompetence, of systematic failure at the highest levels. That's an extraordinary claim that would require extraordinary evidence. And forgive me, but one colonel's midnight calculations against the combined analysis of hundreds of defense professionals and billions in investment. Actually, Minister, Colonel Morrison isn't alone in his assessment. The voice came from the side of the room. Air Marshal Chen had risen from his seat, his expression grave. The room's attention pivoted instantly. Chen wasn't just any voice. He was the second most powerful military officer in the country, a man whose opinion could end careers or launch them into the stratosphere. I asked Colonel Morrison to attend this briefing. Chen continued, his voice measured but carrying absolute authority. Not because I wanted disruption, but because I needed truth. 3 months ago, I participated in a classified wargame exercise with US Indo-Pacific Command. The scenario was simple: coordinated strike on northern Australian infrastructure. We, Australia, were eliminated as a combat effective force in 4 hours and 17 minutes. The American officers were as shocked as we were. They'd assumed our capabilities matched our rhetoric. Whitfield looked like he'd been struck. That exercise was highly theoretical, using parameters that assumed optimal conditions for defenders. Chen cut him off. Perfect weather, full intelligence, complete readiness. We still lost. Catastrophically. And when I returned and reviewed our actual deployed capabilities against the exercise assumptions, I realized we'd been graded on a curve we can't actually meet. Colonel Morrison's numbers aren't speculation. They're conservative. Minister Huntley's political mask was cracking now, revealing genuine alarm beneath. Air Marshal, if what you're both saying is accurate, why wasn't this raised through proper channels? Why ambush this briefing? Because proper channels have been raising it, Minister, Chen replied quietly. For 18 months, I have 17 separate reports from various commands detailing capability gaps. They were all marked noted and filed. Because acknowledging them would mean admitting that the previous government's defense white paper was fantasy, that the current government's reassurances to the public are wishful thinking, and that we've prioritized procurement that looks good in press releases over procurement that works in warfare. The tension in the room was now unbearable. Several junior officers looked stricken. Thornton appeared to be calculating his political survival options in real time. But it was Whitfield who cracked first. "This is outrageous," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You bring in some cowboy operator to undermine 7 years of professional development, to trash the careers of hundreds of dedicated personnel, to..." His voice was rising, losing control. "Morrison, you've been a thorn in institutional planning since Afghanistan. Always questioning, always second-guessing, always thinking you know better than the strategic planners who actually understand modern warfare. I understand that plans without capability are just wishes," Morrison said quietly. "And I understand that being honest about our limitations is how we fix them, not how we hide from them." Honest? Whitfield's face was purple now. "You want to talk about honesty? Let's talk about your record, Colonel. 3 formal reprimands for insubordination. Twice passed over for promotion to brigadier because you couldn't play the political game. You're bitter, obsolete, a relic who can't accept that warfare has evolved beyond your little team operations. This isn't about national security. This is about your ego." The personal attack landed like a slap. The room recoiled. Even Thornton looked uncomfortable. This had crossed a line. Professional disagreement into character assassination. Morrison stood very still. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, which somehow made it more powerful. "You're right about the reprimands. All 3 were for questioning operational plans I believed would get people killed. In 2 cases, those operations were cancelled after review. In the 3rd, they proceeded. 4 soldiers died." He paused. "Their names are Michael Kowalski, James Patterson, Sarah Chen, and David Webb. I think about them every single day. And you're right that I was passed over for promotion, because I cared more about being right than being popular, because I prioritized the lives of soldiers over the comfort of planners, and because I couldn't smile and nod while watching us build systems designed to impress ministers rather than defeat enemies." The room had gone deathly quiet. Whitfield's mouth opened, then closed. The rage was draining from his face, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like shame. Morrison continued, his voice still calm but carrying decades of accumulated conviction. "You called me obsolete. Maybe I am. But I've stood on airfields under bombardment. I've watched friends bleed out waiting for support that was 17 minutes away, according to planning documents, but never arrived. I've seen what happens when the theoretical meets the actual, and the gap between them is measured in body bags. So yes, I question, I second-guess, because the cost of being wrong isn't your career, Brigadier, it's their lives." He gestured toward a photograph on the wall, a contingent of young Australian soldiers, barely out of their teens, in formation. "Those kids trust us to prepare them for what's actually coming, not what we wish was coming. And right now, we're failing them. We're sending them to defend a northern approach with systems that might as well be cardboard cutouts. And when the shooting starts, if it starts, they're going to discover what I'm telling you now, except they'll discover it while watching Darwin burn. Minister Huntley had gone pale. Her political instincts were screaming at her, but for the first time she seemed to be listening to something deeper. Colonel Morrison, if your assessment is correct, what you're describing is a catastrophic strategic vulnerability. The political implications are irrelevant compared to the operational reality, Morrison said. But since we're discussing them, yes, admitting this publicly would be devastating. It would raise questions about competence, about resource allocation, about 7 years of development and $3 billion in expenditure. It would terrify the public and embolden adversaries. It would probably end several careers in this room. Thornton found his voice again, though it had lost its earlier condescension. Then why are you pushing this? If disclosure is so dangerous? Because silence is more dangerous, Morrison replied. Because vulnerability unacknowledged is vulnerability uncorrected. Because our enemies already know our limitations. They have satellites and intelligence services and analysts just as competent as ours. The only people we're fooling with our silence are ourselves and the Australian public. And when the truth reveals itself, and it will, either in an audit or an actual attack, the betrayal of that deception will be worse than the vulnerability itself. Chen nodded slowly. He's right. The question isn't whether to acknowledge this. It's how quickly we can fix it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The institutional machinery of self-protection was grinding against the reality of Morrison's words. Careers hung in the balance, reputations, political futures. Then Whitfield did something unexpected. He sat down heavily as if his legs could no longer support him. When he looked up, the anger was gone, replaced by something raw and wounded. I believed in this system, he said quietly. 7 years. I convinced ministers, lobbied Treasury, fought procurement battles. I believed we were building something revolutionary, something that would actually protect. His voice cracked slightly. I have a daughter at university in Darwin. She's 22. I told her she was safe, that her father had built something that would keep her safe. The vulnerability in his confession rippled through the room. This wasn't the arrogant general anymore. This was a father confronting the possibility that his life's work was inadequate to protect his own child. Morrison's expression softened. He walked around the table and stood before Whitfield, not towering over him, but addressing him as an equal. Brigadier, believing in your work isn't a weakness. It's what drove you to create something in the first place. But belief without testing becomes faith without foundation. Your system isn't worthless. It's incomplete. The radars are excellent. The command architecture is actually innovative. The problem isn't what you built. It's that you stopped asking difficult questions once you'd invested too much to comfortably acknowledge the gaps. Whitfield looked up, searching Morrison's face for contempt and finding none. I know about your daughter, Morrison continued. I know because I read the interview you gave to Defense magazine 2 years ago, where you mentioned her, and I need you to understand. I'm not trying to destroy your work. I'm trying to complete it, because if we're honest about the gaps, we can fill them. If we're honest about the timeline, we can compress it. If we're honest about the dependencies, we can address them. But that requires killing your pride before it kills your daughter. The bluntness was surgical, but it wasn't cruel. It was the calculated precision of someone trying to cut through layers of institutional denial to reach bedrock truth. Thornton spoke up, his voice subdued. What would completion require? Morrison pulled out another document. This one more worn, clearly something he'd been working on for some time. I spent the last 3 weeks during my terminal leave drafting a remediation plan. It's aggressive. It would require acknowledging mistakes publicly. It would require emergency procurement of additional systems. It would require complete restructuring of response protocols. And it would require something this room is going to find very difficult. What's that? Minister Huntley asked. It would require asking the United States for immediate deployment of additional assets to Darwin on a semi-permanent basis. Not as reinforcement, but as primary defense, until our sovereign capability actually matches our sovereign rhetoric. It means admitting we need help, that we can't do this alone, that we oversold our capability and undersold our vulnerability.